Thank you, Aja. I really appreciate it. And also appreciate all the work that yourself, James, and folks in your office have done to not only make today happen, but also all of the programming that you all offer for the CU Denver community. I'm definitely very excited about being here today. I feel like I'm constantly talking about Afro-Latinx identity and like my own experience, but I haven't been able to really, never had a forum in an academic setting to kind of talk more about the history and the richness there. So I really appreciate this opportunity of being tapped to do this and to be able to share with you all and also learn from you all. I definitely want this to be a dialogue and a conversation. So, beyond the presentation, we definitely have more than enough time to be able to chat and ask questions. And I'm a pretty transparent and open book kind of person, so I really don't mind even the personal questions. And should I be uncomfortable, I'm happy to share that. But otherwise, please feel free to, whatever's on your mind, clarification questions. There's going to be a lot of kind of interpolation of my own experience as we go along. So, and that's why if I'm sharing that with you, I don't mind folks asking questions about it. um, and yeah, I'll let Shannon share a little bit about herself before we go right into it. Oh, Shannon, you're on mute. There you go. Nope. Well, at least me. I don't know if it's just me. I can definitely see you.
No, Shannon, I think your mic, if you go to the little arrow by mute. And
it's attached, so they get disconnected or reconnected. My name is Shannon. Currently work as a graduate assistant for CII and Black Student Services. Currently a grad student here at CU Denver. Really glad to be a part of this conversation today. Again, similar to Stephanie, haven't really had a space or seen a space available to talk about Afro-Latinx identity a lot, or even just having a space to develop that conversation even more. It's been more of like an internalized conversation or a conversation in the house or with my friends. So I'm really glad to be here. Also, kind of an open book. If something is too sensitive, I will tell you that, so that way we don't cross any lines. But again, thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thank you for having this space and sharing this space. And I'm excited. I'm really excited.
Great. Well, are there any questions before I get started? All right. All right. So I just want, as I mentioned, there'll be kind of an interpolation of my own kind of experiences. Definitely will tap Shannon and share hers as well. So I just wanted you all to get a sense for, a brief view of who I am. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. I was born and raised in Miami. And I moved to Colorado after undergrad in 2014, in May of 2014. So I'm going about 7 years. I'm a first generation American. So my parents are immigrants from Dominican Republic. I am the youngest of my siblings. My two eldest sisters were born in Dominican Republic as well, but myself and my brother were born in the United States. So pretty much all of my family was born in Dominican Republic except us and similar first generation cousins. In terms of race and ethnicity, I self-describe interchangeably as Black, Afro-Latina, Afro-Caribeña, Caribeña meaning Caribbean, or Hispanic. And in terms of nationality, I identify as Dominican, and we'll kind of get into that because I know you just heard me say that I was born here and I've lived here my whole life, but I identify as Dominican, not American. My first language is Spanish, and that's also what I speak at home. My parents don't speak English, but my dominant language by virtue of having been born and raised here is English. So Shannon, do you want to share a little bit of these regarding yourself?
Definitely. So for me, not first generation, actually. They fall into a strange category that people are actually doing studies on now. It's this 2.5 generation um, American. So on my mom's side is actually where the story of immigration, originally from Barbados and the Dominican Republic, comes from, with her being born in America, but my grandfather being born in Barbados, and then other parts, my cousins from Dominican Republic and other surrounding islands. As for how I identify, I guess predominantly all my life it's been Black. Only recently have I really understood like the new emerging term of Afro-Latina, because even within Latina spaces, I was always the Black girl. So growing up being called negrita, things like that, didn't really, or my mom morena, like we were always seen as dark Black. And then also for my dad's side, the family, he's in no way connected to Latin America. His family was the product of chattel slavery, to the point where we actually know the same plantation lands here in America where his family resided, and were sharecroppers until the 70s, basically. So that's kind of been my identity, my story of just existing in a space where it's both Latin American immigrant, having that Caribbean immigrant background, but then also the story of being Black in America, and how that kind of, it felt like a lot of boxes. So right now for me, it's definitely a lot of exploration of those identities and learning more about what that makes me. And then my first language is English, but I grew up actually speaking French, Spanish, and English. So in my household, there was a lot of languages kind of just being tossed around. I actually am originally from New York, so I struggled to speak English for a while until I got older, because sometimes I would stumble over words, stutter over words, because I didn't really learn English in an environment that was stable. So.
Thanks, Shannon. It's interesting because I didn't even think about adding that myself into the presentation, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about it as we go along, but I just realized that it's so important that I can't trace anything beyond being Dominican, or my family being Dominican, I guess. But so I appreciate you sharing that, and it kind of gives me something to think about myself even as I go along. So I just wanted to quickly review some of the terminology, because I realize that it gets really confusing for a lot of folks, particularly because even within the same within the same community, people use different words to self-describe, and we'll talk about that as well. And some of these terms, I just want to be clear too, are still kind of being disputed. So the word Hispanic, which is what I've kind of identified as most of my life, refers to people who speak Spanish, or those who either are descendant from Spanish-speaking countries, and this would include Spain. Latina or Latino refers to people from Latin America, which is Latin America is based on geography, not necessarily language. So this would include folks from like Brazil, for example, who speak Portuguese, but are still located either in the Caribbean or Central and South America. So essentially in that general location, and again, there's caveats to this that we'll talk about, that's what would be considered someone that is Latina or Latino. For some that are familiar with the Spanish language, most words are gendered. So that's why you see Latina or Latino, Latina being the feminine and Latino being the masculine, but a more gender neutral term that has, both of which have in some ways been kind of used and introduced by the academic communities, but there are lots of places like in Colombia where they've actually been used for tons of years, especially by queer populations and communities. That term being Latinx, or sometimes you'll hear people saying Latine. And due to conjugational issues with the X, a lot of people are turning to Latine, and I tend to use that myself. And I'll kind of use those interchangeably throughout. So both of those are essentially gender neutral terms to refer to someone of Latin American descent. So anyone from Latin America, again, in terms of geography. Then there's what we're going to be chatting about most of today, which is being Afro-Latinx, which refers to people from Latin American countries with African ancestry. So essentially Black Latinos. Then there's something that was actually new to me upon moving to Colorado. I was not familiar with this term myself, and that is Chicanx, which there's multiple spellings, but the pronunciation is the same. So this is a chosen identity for people of Mexican descent born in the US. So there's kind of speaks to the hybridity there as well, mostly for first generation plus Mexicans. And it often carries political, like a strong anti-assimilation politics behind it. And then there's Spanish, which is both the language as well as people from Spain. So if you have questions about this later on, I'm happy to chat about them. And like I said, there's still a lot of contention around this because some people consider that non-Latin language speaking countries cannot be considered Latinx. So for example, like Jamaica or Suriname, even though there are certain there are some that are more seemingly contentious than others. But some countries, due to political history or isolation, they don't use the term at all, even if they squarely fit in Latin America in terms of geography. So for example, people from French Guiana, people from Haiti, really don't often associate themselves with that term, but also kind of the gatekeepers of Latinidad tend to, or Latinness, tend to also exclude. So it's kind of like a chicken or egg kind of story there. So moving along, this may help kind of visualize. I know that a lot of you may not know exactly what flags this responds to, but it's kind of helpful to see in some ways kind of like a Venn diagram. So, you know, on the left, where it says Latino or Latine, these are some of the examples, and it's not exhaustive, of some countries that would be considered Latine. Then on the right, you see that Spain would be one of the only countries that would be Hispanic but not Latine. And then in the center is essentially folks that would fall into both. So on the left, just for curiosity, there's Brazil, Haiti, French Guiana, Guadeloupe, and Martinique. And these are just some Caribbean islands, but of course there's more, like Dominica, St. Martin, etc. And then I thought that it would be helpful to see the map, which again speaks to the geography of Latin America. So again, Caribbean, Central, and South America. So during the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of people don't realize that significantly more people from Africa were brought to South America than were sent over to the United States. So this is kind of one of the reasons, and a lot of, at least myself, like I wasn't taught this when I was in grade school myself. So I think there's a lot of, this contributes to a lot of the reason as to why people don't realize or don't think of Black people very often when they think of Latinos or when they think of South Americans or Hispanics. So during Latin America's colonial period, actually about 15 times as many African enslaved people were taken to either Spanish or Portuguese colonies than to the US, which in some ways makes perfect sense. This map is a little exaggerated, but it makes sense in terms of proximity. Certain areas of South America are obviously much closer to Western Africa than the United States. So currently something around 130 million people of African descent live in Latin America. And that's out of about 650. So that's about 20%. And I've actually seen some more recent estimates that say it's actually closer to a quarter, so closer to 25%. So we just can't underestimate the number of Black Latinos, of Afro Latinos or Afro Latinas that are present and that have contributed to much of the culture, much of what we know or understand to be Hispanic culture or Latina culture is actually Black culture. And we'll talk a little bit more about as we go along. So I also wanted to share this map, and this was provided by the Pew Research Center. So it just kind of shapes more recently, I think this is from 2014, the number of Afro-descendants in Latin America. And these numbers are in the thousands. So as you can see in Brazil, it's a very, very large amount, large number of Afro-descendants. And this, again, this doesn't mean that these folks identify as Black or identify as Afro-Latine. It's just folks that have Black or African ancestry. Oh, sorry. So the first thing I wanted to chat about is very much the difference and kind of why the term Afro-Latina is so important is because of the difference in the way that we conceptualize and think about race in the United States versus in Latin America. In the United States, race is a very Black or white thing. There's a Black or white paradigm. It's very binary. It's stripped of much of its nuance and subjectivity. And one perfect example of that would be the one drop rule, right? Where if you had even one Black ancestor, you were deemed Black. So race is not necessarily grounded in, as we know, in biology or scientific research. It's a social construct, and more importantly, a contextual construct, because from country to country, it'll differ. So even me saying that it differs in Latin America compared to the United States, even that in itself is a generalization, because from country to country within Latin America, it also differs greatly. So race in the US was construed as an ideology to help rationalize slavery, but has of course endured, and we still use it now, and has really transcended the condition of being enslaved, right? So you no longer have to be enslaved to identify as a race or to be taxonomized as one. As race was being created as an ideology, Black people, historically, were considered good laborers. And in this time of settler colonialism, the colonists really depended largely on Black people to survive and to maintain their labor force as cheaply as possible and produce wealth for white upper classes. So as anti-slavery movements began to rise, those that supported the continuation of slavery needed a way to rationalize and defend slavery as an institution. So they began focusing on physical differences, on phenotype, to argue that Black people specifically were naturally and inherently inferior and suited for slavery. So through the construction of these racial categories, colonists essentially were able to classify and rank or racialize people to structure our society. So their idea of racial groups at that time were white people, Europeans, what they refer to as Indians, so Native or indigenous communities, and then Africans or Black people. So those physical traits were used to create race as a social identity marker, and they were linked to hierarchy and sociopolitical status and power, much of which are conflated even now, even today. So in the context of chattel slavery specifically, and I say that because there's of course the history of Irish folks being enslaved. So in the context of chattel slavery, the US essentially became home to a very unique and exclusively racial slave system. I didn't know, sorry, I didn't know if you wanted to share anything on there, Shannon.
Yeah, in regards to, and I think you might have this on the next slide or a future slide,
Mhm.
but Black-white paradigm is really interesting to consider when you're talking about Latinx studies or Latinx communication, how identity is formed, because when you identify as Latinx, but then you're transplanted into the United States, you now have to exist also within the Black-white paradigm, which for me meant a lot of erasure of the whole Latinx identity for a lot of my family, because in the United States, it's Black or white. Like only recently it feels like Latinx identity has become mainstream or mainly talked about, or even recognized as a spectrum. So in that way, I completely agree. In my personal opinion is that I feel like America struggles with the spectrum of race, or the construct of race itself, because that paradigm is really destructive in erasing a lot of people's identities.
Right, exactly. And the fact that it's, of course, being done with a lot of intention speaks to like how that leads to us, you know, kind of diluting our own identity, or sometimes having negotiated. Yeah, and we'll chat about that as we move forward. So with that, um, in the United States, we've essentially been reduced to phenotype, right? And I think I don't believe it was the case in this last census, but prior to that, I think there's like 5 or 6 racial groups. So imagine the fact that we taxonomized 300 million. 300 million in the US, of course, but really we're taxonomizing the world into just 6 boxes, right? So this is a way of simplifying it, but there's a lot of complexity that we are just simply erasing or ignoring in pursuit of that simplicity. So when we talk about phenotype, we're talking about observable characteristics, right, or traits of an organism. So as it relates to humans, we're talking about skin tone, hair texture, eye shape, waist to hip ratio. And you know, all this to say, I am not a geneticist and I'm not a biologist, so I recognize that even within this there's more complexity, because even behavior is actually considered part of phenotype. But as we know, there are things again like noses, fuller lips, dark skin, or just skin tone in general. um, uh, well, those pieces tend to be associated with Black people. Things like monolids tend to be associated with Asians, specifically Eastern Asians. Light skin and blonde hair tends to be associated with white people and things of that sort. So that's what I'm talking about when I mention phenotype. Excuse me. But then there's also a phenotypic continuum, right? So there's this difference in terms of the salience of certain markers. So it doesn't mean that every feature that is associated with Blackness means that every Black person has them. And also, based on a number of different reasons, some could just have certain things could be more pronounced on some people more than others. And years, particularly in Latin America, years of miscegenation, particularly as it relates to mestizaje, which is mestizaje in general really speaks to just mixed race. But in the Latin American context is very often conflated with the mixture of white and native people. So years of that has really contributed to what many of us tend to think, or many in the US context tend to think of as the prototypical Latina person, right? So that's J-Lo. Typically, that's the first person people reference when they think of Latinidad. So people like Jennifer Lopez, Eva Mendes, Gina Rodriguez, AOC, that's who people tend to think of when they think of Latinx people. But in Latin America, there's much more fluidity and ambiguity. And again, I kind of painting with a broad brush there by saying Latin America. And a large number of Latinas, regardless of their race, actually, even in the terms, you know, they either refer to themselves as Latinx or Hispanic, or just as their nationality. So they themselves kind of obscure their identities. But race in Latin America is much more contextual and it's much more imprecise. And some of that has been in part to resistance to European ideologies, so kind of in response to colonialism. So it's not as easy to just say you're Black, you're white, you're Asian, as it is in the United States. So racial hierarchies still very much characterize socioeconomic structures and stratification in Latin American countries. But it just doesn't mean that our identities are binary the way that they are in the United States. So I put some examples here, and these are some of the ones that I'm aware of. But again, I'm Dominican, so these are some of the ones that like I've heard of, but there could be very many more in other countries in terms of identity markers that people use beyond just Black or white or what have you. So mestizo, trigueño, mulatto, indio, jabao, chino, all of these tend to really speak to phenotypical characteristics. So I know for some of you that are not familiar with these words, like mestizo again refers to a mix of white and native. Trigueño literally just kind of means like tan. It's a certain shade of a person that you would refer to as trigueño. Mulatto tends to mean mixed with Black ancestry, so Black and native or Black and white. Indio tends to mean native. Chino tends to mean Asian. And jabao tends to mean a very fair-skinned person that still exhibits African features. Sometimes it could be like a very fair-skinned blonde person, but they have, perhaps a rounder nose or a curlier hair. That word is used a lot in the Caribbean, particularly in Cuba. And some of them, of course, carry a negative context. But a lot of these, as I mentioned, tend to be contingent on just like the shade of your skin tone. So in the US, a lot of people that would refer to as any of these terms would just be Black. But if you're in Dominican Republic or Cuba or Puerto Rico or in another Latin American country, you would fit squarely within one of these, and you wouldn't perhaps use the word Black to identify, or Afro-Latino. So context and history definitely matter when it comes to these terms, or also with just the way that we see race and ethnicity. So for example, Black Dominicans, and this is also coming from the Pew Research Center, Black Dominicans are far less likely to refer to themselves as Black when you compare them to Panamanians. And it's a lot of the history there in US occupation in Dominican Republic and things like that, as well as our history with Haiti. And we tend to, and again, this is just one example, but Dominicans tend to essentially relegate Blackness to others, and others in our specific context means Haitians. So even if they are unambiguously Black, they would tend to refer to themselves, are less likely to refer to themselves as Black. But Black Dominicans in the US are far more likely to refer to themselves as Black compared to Black Dominicans on the island. Again, in some cases for the same reason. And in the US are also far more likely because it is so binary here. So you aren't able to kind of get away with just referring to yourself as, mulatto or moreno, or just these other terms that we use back on the island, because here folks will tend to see you as, you look phenotypically Black, therefore you are. So racial categorization really differs from self-identification, at least for a lot of Latinx folks. And by that, I mean that people don't necessarily, because they are Black doesn't mean that we'll identify as such. And same thing even with white Latinx. For many white Latinx, you call them white and it's offensive to them because they will identify more closely with their nationality. They're like, I'm not white, I'm Colombian. And of course, those two things are not mutually exclusive, but it's part of the identity development for a lot of folks. And on that, there's also this idea of pragmatic relativism. And by that, I mean that, these countries with significantly more white people, like Chile, for example, or Uruguay, or Argentina, they allow for a lot less of this fluidity that I'm talking about within Latin America. So compared to Cuba, or maybe Cuba's not the best example, but Puerto Rico, or Dominican Republic, they would definitely allow for more of that kind of more categorizations of race. So, for example, in Dominican Republic, the same person can be considered moreno, which means brown skin, or prieto, which means dark skin, depending on who you ask. So even for me, my brother is significantly darker than I am, and he always referred to me when we were children as light skin. But under no circumstances in the United States would I be referred to as light skin, even among Black populations. So African American populations also kind of have this shading where we have light skin, brown skin, dark skin. And I would very much fall squarely into brown skin in the United States. But again, my brother, because I'm lighter than him, so it's kind of like this, it's almost as if race is, in the eyes of the beholder, essentially. And then there's this idea of being white passing, or seeking white adjacency. And I personally have a lot of issues with this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this could refer to literally physically being white passing, meaning being ambiguous. And in terms of meeting white Anglicized standards is when folks just kind of can't tell, or when you literally kind of, depending on what you're wearing, or depending on your hair or your accessories, literally just may look white American, or white non-Latine in certain occasions, and in other cases will very much be read or perceived to be Latine on its own, kind of divorce of race. And then they're seeking white adjacency in a very political sense. Much like in the US, white supremacy abounds in Latin America. And for that reason, white folks tend to have more resources, have more power, and things of that sort. So people seek white adjacency for the sake of being better off, for the benefits that are associated, be it social, political, cultural, et cetera. So in places like Brazil, for example, some people refer to themselves as white if they have amassed wealth, regardless of their race, even if they're very clearly not white, they would refer to themselves as such. And in other countries, again, some seek adjacency, or white adjacency, for the social advantages. So, for example, this is kind of, it's a very convoluted history, but me being from Miami, a lot of the folks that I know and have gotten to know are white Cubans, and they are very much heavily white identified, and essentially are very hopeful to be able to assimilate to American culture because of the social advantages that they see with it. And then there's just ethnicity and heritage, right? So it's this idea of self-identifying, as I mentioned earlier, as a nationality, as just Hispanic, as just Latine, et cetera. It's this idea of, oh, I'm not white, I'm Colombian, for example. And then also, being monolingual, Spanish or Portuguese speaking also kind of determines your experience. Because if, for me, for example, if I didn't speak Spanish at all, in a lot of different spaces that I've occupied, I would be able to just refer to myself as Black, as African American, and it would be fine. But there's something about me speaking Spanish that almost like lends legitimacy to my Afro-Latinidad. And I definitely want to tap Shannon here, because I know that her experience has in fact been different from mine. So if you want to speak to that, Shannon.
Yeah, for me, it was mostly along the lines of language and policing. So linguistically, because of all the different languages that were spoken in my household, it was really hard growing up. I remember an incident specifically that happened when I was in the 5th grade where it almost felt like I had to choose between my mom and dad, like speaking, do I learn French like my dad? Do I learn Spanish like my mom? Like which part of my identities do I feel like I'm choosing? So kind of going off of that legitimacy of speaking Spanish to be Afro-Latinx. And then in regards to policing, my dad, who has no like connection to Latin America whatsoever, would sit me aside from my mom and tell me, in America, if you get pulled over, if you get stopped by a police officer, what are they going to put on the papers? And the answer is black. So that's what you identify in the United States as black. Whereas it might be different in the Dominican Republic, where, as you stated, there's all these different terms for like the degree that you are mixed or your phenotype. Whereas here it's just instantly black, white, etc. There was even an incident that happened to one of my friends when she was visiting the DR, where she's originally from Ghana, and she actually was pulled aside by police officers in the Dominican Republic because they believed she was Haitian and did not belong on the Dominican side of the border. Now, her looking more phenotypically African, looking more phenotypically black than me, contributed to that, which, you know, she did nothing wrong, but there is a certain degree of like who is accepted on the like black to Latinx scale. So yeah, it's mostly, from my experience, been linguistics and policing that have shaped identity.
Yeah, for sure. And the politics of it, you know, that's kind of a whole nother story. We could talk forever about that. And, you know, Dominicans especially, and the history there with Haitians. And even now, again, you could be born and raised in Dominican Republic. And if you have a Haitian parent, you could lose your citizenship. And that is all based on these ideas of superiority based on race, all of which is so interesting when pretty much all the Dominicans look like me. So it's a very interesting thing, kind of the cognitive dissonance that happens there, among other things. And then there's truly, you know, the actual ambiguity. And that's why I mentioned that I have an issue with this, because a lot of folks will refer to themselves as white passing when they may just very well be white. And by that, I mean is, you know, would you be able to navigate the world or navigate, you know, the US context as a white person with all of the advantages and privileges and power that, you know, contains? So is it white passing, or are you just white? And same kind of for people of other ethnicities. But I do recognize that for some reason, again, even for Black folks, it can really be confusing sometimes. And also just kind of depending on how someone presents. So I want to give you all an example. And I think you all will know who this is. So Cardi B, who is a singer, rapper, among other things, and is also, she's Dominican, and I forget where her other parent is from. I want to say she may be Bayesian, but I don't remember, so don't hold me to that. And Cardi B draws a lot of controversy for a lot of different reasons. But after saying the N-word in one of her songs, I believe, or in an interview, there was a lot of controversy around it because there were a lot of folks who were questioning her race. We're saying essentially, you know, people were trying to determine if it's okay, if she could or she should be using that term. So there's something about her, right, that makes people confused, including Black Americans. So there's something about her that makes it seem like, oh, wait, especially because she speaks Spanish, right? So a lot of people read her as Latina, or some people don't know how to read her at all. So there's something about her in this picture where there's ambiguity there, but there's something about her in this picture that a lot fewer people would think of her as ambiguous. Significantly less people would probably see and I haven't tested this out as research, but my hypothesis is a lot of people would see this picture on the right and see a Black person, but there's something about the picture on the left where you're just not quite sure. So again, this is, for some people, for me, there's nothing that she could wear or put on, or she could shave her head. And to me, I see a Black person, but that's not always the case. And she's just one example, but we could use Meghan Markle is another one that a lot of folks were very confused about, or just unsure about, I guess I should say. But for some people, certain things are just more conspicuous than others. And because of that, some people have the privilege of kind of being able to play and circumvent in certain spaces the way that others, like myself, who is more unambiguously Black, that can't necessarily do the same. But it also depends, again, on the context, because there are certain spaces where Cardi B would enter that everybody would know by default that she's Black, and some where she won't. So in terms of the African roots of Latin America, or just Afro-Latinidad in general, again, this term really refers to people from Latin America with African ancestry, or how I tend to refer to myself as just a Black Latina. I put an asterisk on there because there is some co-opting of that term that is currently happening. And by that, I mean that some people are using that term just to identify with their African roots, even if they, may identify as white or Native or some other race. Like they themselves recognize that they aren't Black, or that they don't navigate the world as a Black person, but they're like, okay, well, I'm Puerto Rican, and I know that Puerto Rico has very strong Black roots, so I am Afro-Latina, which is not the intention of that term. That term is really to refer to or give more specification to Black Latinas, like physically Black Latinas. And among the reasons why this word was generated is to be able to, because we haven't been able to neatly fit into just being Black or just being Latina, particularly within the American context or the US context. So kind of similar to being African American. I don't use that term to refer to myself, but a lot of Black Americans do, because it specifies the Black American experience, because not every Black person in the US is necessarily African American. So if you are from Ghana, if you are from Dominican Republic, if you're from Brazil and you're Black and you're here, it doesn't mean that you share the same history, the specific American history that African Americans do. So that is kind of the same with Afro-Latinidad. That's specific to people that are both Latin American as well as Black. So it's a reclamation of language, of identity, of our roots, and historical contributions. And when I talk about reclamation, it's even beyond Afro-Latinidad. There's a lot of words like, for example, negro, meaning Black, that have historically been used as a pejorative, but now they really signify a more kind of like self-conscious or globalized political identity based on race. But Afro-Latinidad kind of takes that a step forward and speaks to the hybridity of intermixing cultures. So much of what we, as I think I mentioned this a few slides ago, much of what we understand to be Latina culture really originates in Africa. Much of the music that we associate with Latin America, salsa, merengue, salsa being Afro-Cuban, merengue, bachata being Dominican, tango being Argentine, which is a big one because a lot of people don't realize that that has African roots, particularly because Argentina is a majority white country. Champeta, which is Colombian, samba, which is Brazilian, and reggaeton, which is Puerto Rican. A lot of people don't realize that all of those were created by Black people, sure, within Latin America, with African roots or influence, but still created by Black people. Food is an example. These are just some examples from from Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean, religion, Santeria, voodoo, candomblé, which is a practice in Brazil and some other places. All of these are, central to Latin American culture, and are all directly influenced by African roots and created by Black people or developed by Black people. So this kind of begs the question about exchange versus theft, right? So this intermixing is in many ways a beautiful thing, right? And there's a lot of room for cultural exchange. And in those countries, it's so blurred where when you think of reggaeton, for example, you think, okay, that is a Puerto Rican genre. You don't recognize it as a Black Puerto Rican genre. You just say, oh, that's what Puerto Ricans listen to, which is there's truth to that, but the issue is when it becomes theft in the sense of like who gets the recognition, who is acknowledged for their contributions, whose history is ahistoricized, who's getting the accolades, who's making the money, who's getting the resources, who's being represented, be it in the media or other outlets. So this kind of is one of the reasons as to why it's so important to acknowledge the African roots of Latin America. And kind of on that note, the pervasive racism, which is global, not necessarily limited to just Latin America, but it contributes to the continued invisibility of Afro-Latinas. It's the reason why so many folks would look at me and never think that I could be Latina. Much of the reason is because, we lack any representative visibility in popular culture and the media. Excuse me. And this is across the board. But I thought it would definitely be very important to mention that telenovelas, which are Spanish soap operas and very much very strong cultural thing, they don't often include or star Afro-Latinas unless they're depicted as the help. In many ways, the way that it is in the US in certain cases. And of course, that's changed with modern times, but historically that's been the case. And we just saw, the whole issue with Aunt Jemima, for example, and it's no different in Latin America. So major TV networks that are major, Latina or Spanish-speaking networks like Telemundo or Univision, they often market white Latinas or the ideal of mestizaje. So this ideal, going back to, the J-Los of the world and the Salma Hayeks, they speak to this ideal of what Latinidad looks like. So that contributes to why so many of us think that every Hispanic person or every Latina person looks like J-Lo, because that's what's reinforced in the media. So in the US, Afro-Latinas often are depicted as I mentioned earlier, either one or another. So many cases, even when you do see an Afro-Latina person in a movie, they are casted in that movie as a Black person or as a Latina person, but very rarely as both. Or at least they don't get to explore both in the character development. So oftentimes that puts you in a position to have to choose, even in familiar or interpersonal relationships. So there are many cases where like, at least for me personally, where I've had to either pick my Hispanicness or my Blackness. And there's, again, that kind of is speaking to this idea of authenticity, because I just have to be as strongly Latina or as strongly Black to like kind of be accepted, rather than being able to like bring my whole self and that hybridity into a certain space. Shannon, did you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so going back actually to the previous slide as well, for me it was a lot of the aspects of what is seen as Latina culture coming from Africa. It's a lot of erasure of the origins of certain things. Like the recipe for mofongo is actually found to originate in the Congo as almost like a mashed, almost like a mashed cassava or mixture there. And then even there's some aspects of my own experiences religiously that have been kind of restricted, specifically within the realm of voodoo, hoodoo, Catholicism, going to Catholic church when I was younger, but then also having hoodoo and voodoo practices from my grandmother, from my family at home, and then having to reconcile the aspects that are seen as negative or dark about voodoo, hoodoo, Santeria, things like that. But then it's accepted but not accepted within mainstream Latinx culture. That's been like a difficult thing, especially now that there's like a resurgence of that. Now some people are using their non-colonial influences of religion to reclaim that aspect of themselves. So there is a movement now to begin reclaiming things like Santeria, hoodoo, voodoo, for almost like a global Black movement, since a lot of those practices originate in Africa. But within Latin America, there's still, it's odd because it's a very thin line to walk between how openly accepted it is to practice that versus how much you have to keep it behind closed doors. As now that's presently that's changing, but for the past, I mean, throughout my whole family, like that's always been a quiet talk thing, like throw a blanket over it when guests come over and stuff like that.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, I still, to this day, have never really talked to my parents about race. Like we don't, it's just not something we talk about. Even when it comes, even if we're referring to, non-Black people, we just don't really talk about race. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And let's see where we are. So to that end, this is growing, thankfully. We are seeing more Afro-Latinos or Latinas in the media. Certainly not in a representative sense still, but thankfully, we are seeing just a little bit more growth in this. And unfortunately, it wasn't in this picture, but for those that are familiar, the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, he is supposed to be casted as an Afro-Latino. So some folks on here that some folks may see, Jarrell Jerome in the center, Basquiat, that a lot of folks don't realize was Puerto Rican and Haitian, Cardi B again, Dasha Polanco, Celia Cruz, and some other folks on here, some actors and baseball players, poets, etc. So some of Latinidad's shortcomings, and this is just Latinness in Spanish, is one of the reasons why folks feel compelled to, use kind of this preface as Afro-Latino. And again, it's to the name of the series, right? This idea of split stories or hyphenated stories, right? Being Latina, this idea of being Latina is really a forged pan-ethnic geopolitical identity that's built around, the shared experiences, or intended to be built around the shared experiences of colonialism, immigration, language, etc. And although there's merit to that, and there's definitely cultural aspects that unite us, it doesn't acknowledge racism, right? And it doesn't acknowledge the vastly different experiences that Latinas have depending on race, and oftentimes depending on class, and oftentimes those two things are conflated. So this idea of just being Latine, or identifying as Latina, which a lot of people, again, just identify as just Hispanic or just Latina without saying they're white, without saying they're Native, without saying they're Black, etc. It really blurs, again, these experiences, and leads to erasure, a historicism, and lack of acknowledgement, especially, as I mentioned before, when it comes to sociocultural contributions. So it particularly blurs Black and Indigenous experiences, which differ dramatically pretty much in every single Latin American country. So I studied abroad in Peru. And one of the things that I learned while we were working with Native communities on the Peruvian Amazon was that many of them still do not have any rights over the land that they've occupied for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the experience for a white Peruvian in Peru and an indigenous Peruvian very dramatically or just diametrically opposed, essentially. And this is also related to, again, who has power, who has resources, et cetera. So this is really no different than it is in the US. So Afro-Latinas in Latin America disproportionately lack access to basic services, including health services. They lack political power and representation. They bear the brunt of policing and justice systems. Black women, and particularly Black trans women, bear disproportional gender-based violence. So a lot of those disparities that we see based on race in the US are mirrored in Latin America. And beyond that, one of the issues that is presented, and again, I always want to bring back to the source of this being racism, is what we refer to as internalized racism. And by that, I mean that the legacy of racism and colonialism has really contributed to our distortion of racial identity and this willingness to just kind of reject it and again, and just obscure it by just using the word Latine or Hispanic to self-describe. But anti-Blackness, as I mentioned earlier, is pervasive in Latin America. So this quote that I put on here, this idea of mejorar la raza, is something that I've heard pretty much my entire life. So that's the idea of improving your race. So the goal is to essentially make your race as white as it could be, ultimately. So since I was young, it's always kind of been like this running joke that I'm going to marry a white person with blonde hair and blue eyes. Like that is the goal. That's when I know I've made it, when I've been able to marry a white person, have mixed children, and hopefully those mixed children will continue marrying white people, and so on and so forth. And that is emblematic of the deep anti-Blackness and racism that exists in Latin America. And that's why this idea of Latinidad on its own really does not speak to the experience that a lot of Black Latinos have or Latinas have. But this also contributes to this idea of internalized racism, right? So internalized racism being conscious or unconscious acceptance of white supremacy and thus of Black inferiority. So it's this idea that of just rejecting anything that comes with Blackness. Or oftentimes with assigning Blackness to others, as I mentioned in the example earlier with Dominicans and Haitians. So this again leads people to identify with their ethnicity or their nationality rather than with their race. And frankly, I am in all vulnerability, I was one of those people. I recognized that it benefited me to play up my Hispanicness living in Miami, where 99% of my friends were all white Cubans. And I downplayed or rejected, to the extent obviously that I could, my Blackness. So I didn't refer to myself as Black until I was about 20 or 21 years old. So, and this is not something that I was told, it was not suggested to me. My parents didn't walk me through this. It's just something that I learned and I picked up and I recognized what benefited me and where I had advantages and where I didn't. And I recognized that white Cubans treated me differently than they did my Black American counterparts. And again, it's this idea of speaking Spanish or being more similar to them in a cultural sense that contributes to that behavior on my part. So, and sometimes you are, because of internalized racism, other things, you are othered by your own. So in my case, the moment that my Black American friends learned that I spoke Spanish, they'd be like, oh, you're not Black, you're Spanish. But I'm like, but wait, and both things. That, or they do, a lot of people, and not just Black Americans, will refer to me as half Black, half Latina. And I'm like, well, I'm not half Black, I am fully Black, and I am fully Latina. I am just both things at once. And I can't divorce, those things from my identity. And I won't talk too much about this, but we saw these Dyckman protests, Dyckman being a neighborhood in New York City. There was this protest in June 2020, and it was essentially Black Lives Matter protests near a mostly Dominican and Puerto Rican neighborhood. And the Black Lives Matter protesters were being ousted by the Dominicans. And that kind of catalyzed a conversation about race and about how a lot of, and I just pick on Dominicans because I'm Dominican, tend to just identify again with their ethnicity and want to reject anything that has to do with Blackness, even though, police officers in this country are not going to treat me any differently than they would a Black American person simply because of my ethnicity. So the idea is that we are still racialized, and more often than not, we don't really get to claim our race because our race is claimed for us. And in the US, seeking white adjacency will not really change the way that we're perceived as it may, in certain areas of Latin America. Shannon, I know you were echoing a lot of that. Did you want to speak to some of that?
Yeah, so 100% to everything, especially with going back to race is chosen for us in America, because growing up, it was always definitely a conflict between my mom and dad a lot when regards to like my identity as a Black person. My mom being that, again, identifying as Afro-Latina, coming from the Caribbean, things like that, versus my dad who had a very American context. It was actually a lot of anger at times too, like where my mom would say, well, I don't identify as African American. My dad would be like, why don't you? So it'd be a lot of back and forth. And like how you said, even within our own communities, there's a lot of conflict, anger, and sometimes even mistrust or like jealousy, despise for coming out as, and it's strange to even use that terminology, coming out as Afro-Latina. And for me, it's been like, it's also like the fetishization of phenotypes and like appearances. So for a long time for me, that meant like the difference in how I get treated when it's winter and my hair is straight versus when I have my braids in and it's summertime. And it used to bring me so much anger because I would see like the differences in how I'm treated, the differences in who's attracted to me, like the fetishization of, oh, are you mixed versus are you Black? And it's like, that used to fill me and still sometimes does today. It's like a lot of conflict and anger. For me, it's kind of resulted in wanting to look as Black as possible or Black as possible for the United States context. So that way it can't be questioned. It's more of like an aggressive stance against the institution that is race within the United States. But then also considering it within a Latinx context, like I'll go to clubs, I will speak Spanish, and then I hear like snickering, laughter, or like judgments from people who are not necessarily Afro-Latino, but within Colorado, for example, like I speak Spanish, but people who are Mexican won't speak Spanish back to me, or they'll like judge that I'm speaking Spanish in the first place. And there's still that dynamic of you don't belong.
Yep. Thank you. Yes, I will definitely be adding to that in a few slides because yes, absolutely. And then there's something that I didn't add to, which as you were talking reminded me of, and it's the idea of colorism, right? Which, within the community, among the things that get fetishized is, the color of your skin, but as well as, not having curly hair, but very loose curls. Or things like that that make you look mixed or like as a hybrid. There are benefits to that versus being more, having more traditional African features. So with that, and especially when you just mentioned what you said about kind of trying to overcompensate and look as Black as possible. I also won't get too far into this as our time is running out, and I want to make sure that people have time to ask questions. Nigressen's theory really describes the process of becoming Black, of developing your Black racial identity. It extends through history by those that have been victimized by racism and white supremacy. It was largely developed by Dr. William Bill Cross, who I was fortunate to have as a professor, and he's still there at the University of Denver, so not very far from us. So essentially it speaks to these stages, the pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, and then internalization. And again, I won't speak to them too much, but this idea of internalized racism will kind of really fall into the pre-encounter stage. And that's why I wanted to share this. So, that is very much categorized by miseducation, assimilation, and self-hatred. So it's like associating those negative stereotypes, internalizing them, having very low race salience, being very pro-American in terms of like your racial group orientation, and rejecting Black group membership, which is kind of what I was trying to speak to. So needless to say that when my professor was teaching this theory in class, I lost it. And I was like, that's exactly it. That's exactly how it happens. So it's always nice to have theories back this up. And again, won't go into the other ones, but essentially, as you move along in these stages, you begin to essentially become more comfortable and self-describe with Black people. Blackness becomes more salient as an orientation, and it becomes an empowering thing rather than something that folks reject. So Afro-Latinidad in the US context, which also speaks to what Shannon was talking about, is also very different than if we were in Latin America. And even within the United States, it really depends on geography. So one thing is that it depends on location. So experiences differ depending on the population of either white people, Black people, or Latina people, regardless of race. So me being, having been born and raised in Miami, or in areas like New York City, where there's not only tons of Latina folks, but tons of Caribbean Latina folks especially, my experience is completely different than when I'm here. So speaking to what Shannon just said, I used to work at a bank when I was in undergrad in Miami. And folks like white Cubans would just automatically, come to me and speak Spanish. And a part of that is because of the culture there. There's a it's a majority minority place with so many Latina folks that in some ways it kind of makes sense. So my being Black, in some ways it didn't matter. It's like, it's kind of an expectation that you're going to speak Spanish anyway. You're in Miami, how can you not? And I can never tell whether it's a matter of that, or if it's a matter of them reading me as a Black Latina person. But that happens significantly more often in Miami or in a place like New York City than it would here. So here, when I speak to Mexicans, especially, they'll either respond to me in English. They just will look very puzzled, like they don't know what I'm saying. Or what tends to happen is that I can see it in their face that they're just trying to make sense of it. They're like, I hear you, you're speaking the language that I speak, but not quite sure what's happening. And a lot of them tend to think that it's like, oh, I learned Spanish somewhere, like anyone can learn any language, right? Like I, got Rosetta Stone or Duolingo or something, and I just learned Spanish. But they don't read me as like, and some will even ask me, well, where did you learn Spanish? And I always want to say, I learned Spanish where you learned Spanish, same place. But they don't, they tend to not read me as a mixture of the two. And what's most interesting is that even in their own countries, and sometimes even in their own families, they'll have Black people that look exactly like me, but there's still this othering that kind of happens. So beyond that, there's also the importance of, as I mentioned earlier, of speaking Spanish for authenticity. So there's a lot of Afro-Latinas who are very much, deep in the culture, but don't speak Spanish, and or even if you're not Afro-Latina, and there's something about that kind of dilutes for them whether you are truly Latin American or not. And then there's also, of course, the immigrant experience. It's a completely different experience if you're first generation or further American, or if you are, if you are an immigrant from Latin America. And then again, just adjacency to your roots. So, do you cook Latin American food? How often do you visit? Does your partner speak Spanish? Are you teaching Spanish to your kids? Things like that, that kind of, again, are these like stamps or these benchmarks that you're supposed to meet to be truly Afro-Latina. And then there's linguistics and accents, which kind of speaks to what I was saying about my experience with Mexicans here in Colorado. And when I say Mexicans, I'm referring not to Afro-Mexicans, but typically Native or white or mestizo Mexicans. Every Spanish-speaking country in Latin America has a different accent. And even within those countries, there are different accents. But for me, like if you say hello, I will know essentially immediately if you're Colombian, if you're Peruvian, if you're Mexican, if you're Puerto Rican. So because of that, there's a lot of, there's a hierarchy there as well. So even within the Latin American community, Colombians and Venezuelans tend to really look down, for example, and really the kind of South Americans on the way that Caribbeans speak. It's almost like there's this kind of like bastardization of Spanish, which is kind of how they refer to it. So again, this whole geographical thing, there really isn't one way to be Latina, and there's really not one way of being Afro-Latina either. And I'll skip that last part. I just wanted to, again, make sure we don't run out of time. So again, Afro-Latinidad is really deeply rooted among Latin Americans, particularly in the US. As far as I'm concerned, significantly more people refer to themselves as that here than they do, even if it's befitting within Latin America. So Latinidad on its own is really a weak tool to unite Latinas under the same cultural umbrella because it doesn't speak again to specifics of experience. So this terms really allows us to redefine ourselves and redefine those assumptions about Black participation in society. And the fact of the matter is that just as in the US and everywhere else, race affects how we are positioned. So a society that's based on the hierarchy of race means that those that are deemed inferior bear the brunt of violence, of inequality, of dispossession, control, exclusion, etc., regardless of your geographical location. And really what I wanted to leave you all with is that, we exist, we're here, we're real, we're multifaceted people. We have contributed greatly to Latin American and, culture here in the United States. Whether we get acknowledged for it is a different question. And through, Afro-Latinidad and that term, we really are reclaiming space, agency, and expression. So thank you all for being part of this. Thank you, Shannon, to your contributions. I think we have about 10 minutes, so I wanted to save those for questions. And also is it the 1st? No, it's March 2nd. But either way, it's Latinx Heritage Month. And I found that the University of Nevada, Las Vegas on their website, they have a number of Afro-Latinx resources for folks to take a look at. So I just wanted to leave you all with that. Shannon, I didn't know if you had any final comments, but otherwise, happy to take questions. And so sorry that went further than I intended, but I look forward to hearing any questions that have come in.